Starting chapter 26 of your history book, American History, and we're going to be talking about the Cold War. And you wondered, what is the Cold War? As you can see here, you have a clue. Between America and Russia, the communist bloc. And we'll see how this started during the time of President Truman, going on through President Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, on to Nixon, Ford, and Carter. All of these presidents here. So you'll see we'll be going through each one. And this is the period that's called the Cold War. And that's we fought against communism during this time. So you can see as the atomic bomb actually got developed now in the United States, but also in Russia. And so we're going to start with the domestic policies of the Cold War. After World War II, the United States entered the greatest period of affluence. Many Americans prospered and cherished their hard-won freedoms. Challenges came at home, though, and abroad, and liberty was jeopardized in many cases. Responsibilities once handled by families and individuals were surrendered to a large government bureaucracy. American people were gradually surrendering their liberties. The spread of communism manifested in the Cold War and the Cold War ideologies. By late 1970s, Americans' economic problems had increased while her international prestige fell. The decline in morality and patriotism had begun in the 1960s, bringing the United States to one of the most lowest points in history. So here we have some pictures. We have after World War II, of course, we have the baby boom, and we'll be going on that later. And here's a picture of the Cold War of communism in America. I think this is under Kennedy. And so we have the American family and being threatened by atomic bombs during the Cold War. Here's a picture here. Here we have pictures of what's going on, and now we have everything televised on TV. So, and so we know there's a lot of problems that are going to come up because of the time that we lived back then, that time of fighting communism. And also this last part where it says the decline in morality. During the 1960s, there was a decline in morality and a decline in patriotism. And a lot of people, in fact, the Communist Party in America was getting a foothold because Americans were, during that time, of course, it was Vietnam, Korea and Vietnam, and a lot of Americans, were thinking, oh, maybe communism, socialism better. So these ideologies were spreading. Whenever I think of that, I always think, well, does communism, persecute Christians? Yes. Does socialism persecute Christians? Yes. So you see right away, you'll know an ideology that does not come from God if they persecute Christians or if they persecute Israel, because both those are foundational in the Bible. And the enemy hates Israel and he hates Christians, and it causes all these ideologies to stem that are against Christianity, true Christianity, being born again. The Truman years. So we're going to talk about President Truman, and this was post-war. Harry S. Truman succeeded FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and carried out Roosevelt's plans for a final victory and attempt at world peace. He ended the war with the atomic bomb and proceeded to organize that preparations for the United States in San Francisco, those United Nations, I should say. And so the United Nations would develop during this time of Harry Truman. Now, of course, Roosevelt's were very, very up. They were into the League of Nations, especially Eleanor. And so now we have President Truman as for getting together the nations for the United Nations in San Francisco. Truman demobilized the American forces and reconverted industries from wartime to peacetime. In 1944, Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights, providing veterans with discharge pay, hospitalization, government loans for purchasing homes, and onto government loans for purchasing farms and businesses, and also educational benefits. All these for the GI Bill for the veterans that came back from war. So here you have a picture of the GI Bill of Rights here. And of course, here you have Truman, with Eisenhower on here. He's with Douglas MacArthur there talking about post-war challenges and who is this? This was at the Potsdam conference. He's looking and talking to who but communist Russia, Stalin. Post-World War II, inflation now. So there were shortages of labor, and then on from the shortages of labor came the unions. Unionization had forced wages up during the war, and people were able to, even though people were able to save money during the war, we now had, again, problems between labor and unions. After the war, many Americans were ready to purchase homes, cars, clothing, any other goods, and they were denied them during the Great Depression, and even during the war, they were rationed. But now Americans were ready to buy some things. So in World War II and post-war, the boom ended the Great Depression now. So the Great Depression. So now we would have that. I always call it the baby boom, but even that, the post-war, after the war, would be a financial boom. And factories had to make the switch to manufacture peacetime goods during this time. So the factories, remember, they were focused on the war. Now they had to switch back to where they were before the war. There was a high demand for goods and a temporary low in the supply that increased the prices. So here we have a picture of inflation. Prices go up, then people buy less because prices are going up, and then business starts slumping, and then people start losing jobs. So that's why inflation, it has a cycle that it goes through. And so inflation could go into a recession and even depression at that time. So the wage and price ceilings were set during the war, and now they were gone. And so the economy soon stabilized as the free market took over. But here's a picture of how the inflation went. So we have here this is all during World War II. You see how it's going. The inflation is kind of pretty stable. Inflation rate's going down. So this is, as you see, the CPI inflation. You can see then right after the war, it goes up right away because we don't have as many goods. So the goods are higher priced. And then as it goes up, the inflation goes up, then it starts coming down, gradually coming down as things are getting back to normal. So this is what happened after the war. Here's a picture of inflation. So, challenges in Congress. We're going to talk about the Taft-Hartley Act. So there were divisions in the Democratic Party and this caused the Republicans a lot of time to gain control of both the House and the Senate in the midterm election. So these are the midterm elections. The election in 1948 would be for the president, but right now they're in 1946. And so at this time, because, there were divisions in the Democratic Party, we have Republicans gaining control of the House and the Senate. President Truman dealt with a Republican Congress now. After the election of 1948, he had a Republican Congress. And remember, Truman is Democratic. He is trying to go on further with FDR policies, the New Deal. And we'll see how he'll get into the Fair Deal, which is just a continuance of a New Deal, as for the policies of the New Deal. Over a presidential veto, Congress replaced the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 that was in Roosevelt's New Deal with the Taft-Hartley Act. So the Taft-Hartley Act was pretty much Republican. So its purpose was to remove certain labor abuse and curb the growing power of labor unions over individuals and businesses. So the Taft-Hartley Act was basically passed to watch labor unions or reform labor unions. So it required unions to give the company 60 days notice prior to a strike. The union and finances were submitted to the government, and outlawed the closed shop but permitted the union shop. So they couldn't be closed, So this reform which banned closed shops. And the closed shops were all the employees had to be union members. So it'd say, all employees do not have to be union members. They wanted closed shop. Everybody had to join the union. Well, now they're saying, well, that's not. People don't have to join the union if they don't want to. And then it also allowed employers to sue unions for damages that were done in some cases. So it definitely was a monitoring of labor unions. And of course, the labor unions and the left socialists do not like to have, any business control at all, so basically they really supported labor unions. So its purpose was to remove certain labor abuse and curb the growing power of labor unions over individuals and businesses. So just remember, Taft-Hartley Act. This would come in. Of course, Truman at this time, did not put this out, but it did pass. So here we have Truman here, saying, oh, what, let's Taft-Hartley. So the election of 1948 came. I have to say, prior to the election of 1948, there was a significant happening with President Truman of him recognizing Israel as a nation. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But because he did this, everyone thought that there's no way that Truman would win the next presidential election. His own party were very upset against, him, the United States recognizing Israel. So a lot of anti-Semitism back then. So there were divisions. Despite divisions in the Democratic Party, Truman won the election. Everyone thought he would lose. In fact, the Chicago newspaper had printed beforehand, they printed, Dewey defeats Truman. Guess what? Truman won. So Truman defeated the Republican Thomas E. Dewey of New York by a landslide. You can see that picture. So all the blue is Truman states. They all voted for Truman instead. And so here we have the presidential election of 1948. Thomas Dewey was a Republican, and then we have a third party here. But again, Harry Truman, and Truman won the election. And like I said, everyone thought, especially because of him, he had recognized Israel on May 14th, 1948. And so, which is, God really put that together. And like I said, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Truman's program now was called the Fair Deal. Okay, let's remember that FDR, Roosevelt's program, was the New Deal. And they had the New Deal we're talking about a number of years now, because Roosevelt was president for 4 terms. So you take 4 times 4, that's almost 16 years, So we had gone through all these New Deal, and the government had spent a lot of money and a lot of intervention in trying to get us out of the Great Depression. But as for now, Truman, this is post World War II. It was a different attitude. We were out of the Depression, and we're starting into a new era of post-war, and this being prosperous in many ways. And so, but Truman put together his Fair Deal. When I think of President Truman, I think, that he put forth his Fair Deal, but a lot of this Fair Deal did not happen because the Republicans had control of, the Congress. So, and as for his fair deal, it was never as strong as Roosevelt's was, and we consider Truman very much of a moderate when it came to a moderate Democrat, and you would consider FDR a more serious Democrat in that point, although. So he defined his program as the fair deal, as the welfare of all people against special privilege for the few. He wanted to make sure that the special wealthy people didn't have all of the privileges, So there was a lot of socialistic programming during this time, just the same as it was during FDR. The conservative Democrats and the Republicans in Congress rejected Truman's recommendation for national health insurance plan. So just like what we had Obamacare just recently, Truman had a health plan, but it was rejected in the Congress and didn't go through. And federal aid for education, he put forth federal aid for education. That didn't go right, and a couple of civil rights program and a new program to aid farmers. A lot of these he put through because the Congress ended up not signing them, and he ended up, but some fair deal measures of Congress did pass. So not to say all these measures are wrong, it depends on the situation and whether you're making people depend on the government for things. So which can end up to socialism and communism. But here we have the fair deal. Here's Truman here attempting to extend the New Deal and raise the minimum wage, which he did, unemployment benefits, national health insurance, and other Truman lost support among Democrats because he was more of a conservative Democrat. And like I said, most people thought he would lose election, but he didn't. Truman's fair deal measures that passed. So some of his fair deal measures passed, not many, but some did. The federal aid to low-cost public housing and slum clearance. So his heart was to go out there and clear out these slums and bring federal aid, low-cost housing to those in need, and which passed. Number 2, increased minimum wage. It's hard to look at this increased minimum wage because you look, the minimum wage was 40 cents, just 40 cents. And he just raised it to 75 cents. So when we look back about what's the minimum wage now, we're talking about, 12, 13, 14. I'm not sure what the dollars, but now we have back then, the minimum wage was 40 cents and he raised it to 75 cents an hour. And he also increased the Social Security benefits, actually starting, into the Social Security for benefits for people that are retired. As they put into their Social Security, you'll get your Social Security later. And he also increased the FDIC, the bank insurance, from $5,000 to $10,000 in the bank. So insuring our money. So if the banks do have bank runs, as they did in the Great Depression, the banks closed down, the money up into $10,000 in the bank will be insured by the government. So here we have picture FDIC, and we still have that now. We Social Security now. We have Social Security, and we have federal aid. All these things were in the midst of the fair deal that Truman had put forth. Defense Production Act. So the Defense Production Act, Congress gave the president the authority to fix wage and price ceilings. So rapidly growing federal deficits and fueled the inflation with soaring prices and labor demanded wage increases. All these during the defense. Let me describe what the Defense Production Act is. The president may require private business to accept and prioritize contracts for goods and services. So the president may decide who gets which supplies and how many. So especially during times of defense. So it's a crisis. We're in crisis, the crisis stabilization. Here we have trying to balance out. The Office of Price Stabilization permitted prices to rise to meet the increased costs of production. The Defense Production Act was trying to get, in those times, like I said, we saw how inflation soared and stuff. So it was trying to get everything balanced out during this time. Labor unrest, the labor unions and people. Strikes, there were strikes that happened in the steel, oil, coal, and other vital industries, and they all occurred starting in 1952. It's like after the war, everything's going back to normal. We're going to have labor problems again. And that's what happened. There was a threat of a major steel strike, and this caused Truman to seize control of the steel mills under his authority, thinking it might turn into violence. Compromises in wages, fringe benefits, and the union shop. The union shop required new hires to join unions, and industry demands for increase in cost of steel ended in a strike. So here we have, they're looking for compromises in wages and their benefits and all these things. Here we say on strike, post-war. So Truman, he tiptoed around the labor unions, and of course we had the Taft-Hartley too in the midst that was looking into labor unions too. So he wasn't all into the labor unions, although he wanted to make everything fair, the fair deal. So workers in the auto, steel, meatpacking, and railroad industry went on strike in 1946. And President Truman was worried about the railroad workers going on strike the most. So he always looked to say, okay, we don't want to have disasters. We don't want to have violence. And looking before that time, they did. So he was always ready. Here it says, steel workers on strike. Harry said, let me handle it. So anyway. Republican gains in 1950. As foreign and domestic crisis increased, Truman's popularity declined. The loss of mainland China to communism and the growing Korea conflict into war caused many to be dissatisfied with Truman. Now you wonder what, was Truman and was it his fault that China and communism? Well, they were looking to what was happening with communism, thinking how socialism leads to communism and such. But as we were looking, they looked and thought, in China, communism is rising. In fact, China fell to communism. So, right here it says, Japan attacked China in 1937. Both sides, communists and nationalists, joined the forces during World War II, but after the communist leader, Mao Zedong, was the communist leader, and nationalists presided under Chiang Kai-shek. In 1949, Chiang and the officials had to flee to Taiwan. Here's Taiwan, and get out of China. So China was taken over by communism, Chinese communism. So here it says here, I don't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on 4 horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. So basically, they were looking at the fair deal and looking at the Republican gains to make sure, as the Republicans were gaining power, wanted to make sure that they were gaining it, without, causing fear, ignorance, or bigotry in the midst of their campaigning. So there was much criticism of the fair deal and socialistic programs and welfare and all these things, of course, during this time. And the midterm elections did not go well with the Democrats. Communist subversion in the Smith Act and the Internal Security Act. These are pretty important. As the fall of 1949, there were 11 members of the Communist Party, and they were tried and convicted under the Smith Act. And the Smith Act was formerly the Alien Registration Act. So the Smith Act this law made it a crime to advocate the violent overthrow of the United States government or to belong to a group dedicated to that purpose. So Smith Act basically said that if you want to overthrow the government, it's a crime. And if you want to belong to a group that wants to overthrow the government, a communist group or such, then that's a crime too. That's all it said. So the act was challenged and upheld by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court in 1951 upheld the Smith Act, that you were not allowed to, a citizen was not allowed to belong to communist subversion activity that wanted to overthrow the United States of America. So, and then of course came the Internal Security Act, and that was passed by Congress to bring the activities of the Communist Party under surveillance and control. So the Internal Security Act was basically, communist members must register with the government, strict controls on immigrants and any suspects of being communist. Basically, it was keeping control to see what was coming in, who was coming in, I should say. When I say what, with communism coming in. And so they became, and in 1949, here's 11 members that were convicted of the Smith, through the Smith Act for subversion and communist activities to possibly overthrow the government. Communist threats inside the United States. This is amazing, and it's kind of weird because in a few years back, as I was growing up and such, we always heard about this, and everyone says, yeah, that's not real. They're just charging these people, and they really didn't do anything. But now we know, since the fall of Russia, since that time, the fall of communism in Russia, all these records have said, yes, these people were guilty. And so they were guilty of bringing in information from the United States. So Alger Hiss was espionage case. Espionage means spying. So there were communist threats spying inside our government. Alger Hiss lived 1904 to 1996, and he held important State Department positions between 1936 and 1947, so we're talking about the war. Well, he was convicted in 1950 of perjury, or lying under oath, and for denying that he helped to transfer the secret State Department documents to a Soviet agent before the war. So here he was, helping during the war, right at the side of Roosevelt, FDR, in the midst of going over, to Russia and on to the different meetings over there, and he was a spy. His guilt would have been undetected if it were not for the testimony of Whittaker Chambers. So there was a communist spy that had turned key, or decided, that he was going to reveal. It was a double agent, really. So Chambers was a former Soviet spy who had become horrified with the Marxist totalitarians and basically looking at communism, and thinking this is horrific. And so he defected, to the United States. And then he started revealing that we had communists in our government at high places, especially Alger Hiss. So Whittaker Chambers, anyway, they sent investigators. He said, basically, Chambers said that he had a pumpkin patch in Maryland on this farm, and he went to this pumpkin patch and he reached into a pumpkin and he pulled out these secret microfilms of secret state documents that he had received from a spy ring of Alger Hiss. So he said, here it is. This is what they gave me. They gave me these secret documents to give to communist Russia. And so right then, Alger Hiss, he was tried. He was never, he was convicted, but he was never sentenced, really, because of the time that had passed. And Alger Hiss lived in America, till he was old, despite that he was guilty, of doing these crimes. So here's the picture. Let's go. Here's the picture. Here's Alger Hiss, and down here's Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers' testimony. So he said the reason he turned from communism can be summed up in 5 words. What were those 5 words? One night he heard screams. He said, what communist had not heard those screams? They came from husbands torn forever from their wives in midnight arrests. They come from muffled from the execution cellars of secret police, from the torture chambers of Lubyanka, from all the citadels of terror now stretching from Berlin to Canton. They come from those freight cars loaded with men, women, and children, the enemies of the communist state, locked in, packed in, left on remote sites to freeze to death at night in the Russian winter. So that's what he was seeing. And so he decided, I do not want to be a communist. And he went against the communist. And then he revealed all of the secrets that he was given from those that had been spies in our government at high places. The Rosenbergs. The Rosenbergs were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And the one was an engineer and his wife, so they were married. And they actually even had a couple children, They were tried and convicted of espionage, spies, in 1951 for leaking vital atomic bomb secrets to Russian agents. The trial called their crime worse than murder. They were executed, put to death in 1953. The stolen secrets gave the Russians all the information that would enable them to develop an atomic bomb by 1949. So basically, the Rosenbergs, her brother was involved, was actually an engineer involved in the Manhattan Project, and got more involved and gave her, she got it from her brother and onto these two, both of them together, getting all the information to certain other spies. It was a spy ring, but actually they had leaked it, and they were caught, and they ended up getting executed, for their crimes of nuclear espionage. So I'm going to stop right there, and then we're going to continue. We're going to go on to McCarthyism and the Red Scare, but we're getting kind of long, so let's break this up a bit, and we'll get on to the next video.